General observations. I've seen 2 of these videos now from Holy Koolaid. I really feel like he's phoning these in. His questions are not informed. So like he doesn't even understand the question he's asking. Even like if there's someone, a commenter puts a question in and the commenter doesn't know what they're talking about, or they misstate something, the host should actually know how to reformulate the question to say like, oh, I know what this person's asking. They should be informed, right? And then of course, when Ehrman answers, like Ehrman has no idea what he's talking about. He doesn't know what the argument actually is. And he responds to the formulated question, which is terribly formulated. And so he spends like 5 minutes ranting on this thing. And I was like, you're wasting everyone's time because no one disagrees with you, Bart. Because that's not the question. That isn't actually the argument being made. Is he'll refute this argument that no one makes. And then we'll laugh and act like, oh yeah, I refuted the mythicists. It's like, but if you knew what you were talking about, you would know you weren't refuting the mythicists because you would know that's not an argument they make. And in fact, what he would do is he would come back and say, actually, that's not the argument that they make. Here's the argument that they actually make. And here's my response to that argument, right? That's what like someone who was actually competent and gave a damn about what they were doing. And so I find this very disappointing.
The first thing I want to touch on is I got a comment that says, I have no problem accepting that there were a bunch of itinerant Jewish rabbis wandering around the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, or that many of them were apocalyptic preachers looking to expand their various death cults, or that the story of Jesus is an amalgamation of stories based on these men. I have a huge problem with the idea that any of them were divine. Is that what you're arguing?
Yeah. How does he not know that Bart Ehrman is not arguing for a divine Jesus? I'm just astonished by this question. Why is this question even here? Immediately before this, the host went on a long discourse about how this is about mythicism and the pushback from mythicists. And so this is going to be Q&A about mythicism. Why are you wasting time about whether we believe that Jesus was God? That's not the debate we're having. The debate is entirely about this mundane Jesus, non-divine Jesus, whether he existed or not. Now, to Bart Ehrman's credit, he immediately tries to turn it back to what they're supposed to be talking about. The question should not even have been asked. He should have skipped this question and gone immediately to the next one.
No, I don't think Jesus was divine. No, of course not. No, I'm a historian. I'm not a Christian. I'm skeptical of much of the Bible. I think that a good deal of the historical narratives in both the Old Testament and the New Testament are not historical. They're not historical information. And this seminar I'm doing is going to be talking specifically about the birth. What can we say historically about it and what appears to be legendary? Most of it is legendary. That's a very different calculus from saying that there never was a man Jesus. I do not think that he was an amalgam of a group of people. We don't have good information about these groups of people. What we do have good information of is a single man Jesus. And we have numerous sources that talk about him that are independent sources of one another.
I'm shocked that he keeps saying this. It's as if he doesn't understand what the word independent source means. Because he goes into like the whole idea of historical methodology. I am a historian. I have a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University. And one of my specializations was historical methodology, ancient and modern. Independent means actually independent. We don't have any such sources. But explicably, like if Jesus was a kind of a nobody, if he was a lesser version of all these other messianic figures that were going about, then it makes sense that he wouldn't show up on the radar of the world. So I don't think the argument from silence is very strong against the historicity of Jesus. But we've got to admit that we don't have independent sources. You can't find any single example. Every source we have can be linked back to knowledge of Mark. There's really just one source. Ehrman gets into why he thinks Paul is referring to a historical Jesus. You have 2, right? So you've got like Mark and Paul. Everything else is derivative of them.
People don't want to hear it. But if you're looking for historical documentation of a figure from first century, you have very few people in history who are documented the way Jesus was. And so you can disbelieve it if you want. I don't know what kind of historical evidence you would hope for other than what we've got, because it's a lot. I mean, again, I'm not a believer in Jesus. I'm just telling you the evidence is a lot.
I kept getting people asking me like, well, what about Hannibal? Well, what about Spartacus? Well, what about Pontius Pilate? Or what about Herod Agrippa? When Dr. Ehrman here says, what evidence would you want? What we have for Socrates would be enough. That would settle the issue. Caiaphas even. We have more evidence for Caiaphas than we have for Jesus. We're not asking for absurd amounts of evidence. It's the same kind of evidence that we have that convinces us of all the existence of all these other people. From the ancient world. And it's evident from Dr. Ehrman's discussion here, he has no idea what we're talking about. He never listens to us. He never reads anything we say. He knows nothing about what I have said on this issue. We've told you what evidence we would need. How does he not know that? And why isn't he answering that question? Basically, it's like saying like, okay, so I know what you said about what we have for Socrates and why it's convincing that we don't have that for Jesus, but here's why we should still believe in Jesus, or believe that Jesus existed historically. That's not what we get from him, which is what we would get from like a competent, serious historian who's actually taking this argument seriously. But we never get that from him, even after time and time again. And because this is time and time again, for the host in this case to not make the point I'm just making, right? And say like, okay, look, we've heard this from you time and time again, but you're missing the point of what they're saying. Here's what they're saying. What is your response to what they're actually saying? Can we move this conversation forward instead of repeating over and over again these misinformed, ignorant, kind of naive responses? And that's what I would want. If someone's going to get Dr. Ehrman on their show today, we should be able to get somewhere. Like, there's enough information out there for a host to get somewhere on this conversation, and it's not happening here. Roman Empire. Early Roman Empire in particular. When I went through the PhD program at Columbia, we were doing it a little bit differently than they usually do. We had 4 PhD majors, which are major topics that you specialize in. Mine was early Roman religion, early Roman historiography, early Roman philosophy, which includes science at the time. My fourth major was the century of crisis, which is the 3rd century. I specialized in basically the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. Those are my 4 majors. My dissertation was on the scientists in the early Roman Empire. So sociological history of who these guys were, what they did, and what achievements were made, and so on in science. But one of my majors was ancient religion, and obviously one of the major religions of the early Roman Empire is Christianity. So that and Judaism and paganism is one of the things that I studied for my PhD.
There's also a mention of a different Jesus in Philo of Alexandria when one of my commenters talks about a Jewish angelology that's written by Philo, in which Jesus was firstborn of a god and God's high priest. Are there other figures like that they could be pulling elements from? I've also heard a take that Jesus is influenced by Greek mythology, and they're taking stories from these influences from the surrounding cultures.
So there's 2 things here. One, that was badly formulated questions. So it kind of really compresses a bunch of issues with Philo and is too vague with the based on Hellenistic mythology and stuff. The thing that I would expect, though, there's no excuse for Dr. Ehrman to not know what my whole section on Philo is and what relevance it has and so on on the historicity of Jesus. He's claimed recently that he read the book, but he should know what this is about. But it's clear from his response, he has no idea what Thomas is talking about.
The thing in Philo, if somebody said that, tell them to send me a note and tell me what reference they're talking about in Philo.
That is the correct response to someone who'd never heard of me and didn't know what he was talking about. But at this point in history, Dr. Ehrman has heard of me and claims to have read my book. So he should actually know what he's talking about. But this is a reveal. This is a tell. This tells us that Dr. Ehrman has never read my book. He has no idea what's even in it. But at least he should have read the book by now. So he had no idea. And this is why, like, a good host would have reformulated the question to say, oh, Thomas himself should know what he's talking about. Like, he should have read my book. He should know, like, you've gone through all the trouble of having Dr. Ehrman here. He should know how to formulate the questions. So you should be able to say, oh, okay, so there's a section in the book where Dr. Carrier argues that there is an archangel of many names that Philo talks about that has all the same attributes as Jesus, as depicted in Paul. And he even implies, he doesn't say outright, but even implies that there's a reference to a Jesus character in the Old Testament, is this archangel of many names, which would be an interesting coincidence. Larry Hurtado tried to respond to me on this. He didn't read the book either. He responded to like third-party telephone gamed versions of my argument, and then wrote this huge rant about how I'm an idiot and got everything wrong and made a bunch of really embarrassing assertions that were easily disprovable about what Philo never said. There's direct quotes that Philo said these things. He said, Philo never said that. And I'm like, I have direct quotes. It's in the standard literature. It's not right. So I go and I wrote an article about the difference between being a historian and being an apologist. And Larry Hurtado in that moment was acting like an apologist. He wasn't doing the research. He wasn't actually reading the source materials. He was just issuing kind of like a rhetorical rant against something that he spent no time studying to even know what he's supposed to be responding to. It's embarrassing. And it's also, there's no reason to do that. Why would you do that? You're Larry Hurtado. You're a freaking erudite scholar with huge qualifications. You know how to go look at peer-reviewed literature and say, okay, here's the argument, here's why I disagree with it. But that's not what they do. They just make shit up. It's not even responding to the argument that's been made. So Thomas should know that to the point where he could say, well, if Bart Ehrman just told me that he doesn't know what I'm talking about. So I was like, okay, so let me explain what I'm talking about with the Philo thing and hear your thoughts about it. Now, that would still be unfair if it were the case that Dr. Ehrman had never heard of me and had no chance of reading that book before now. It would be unfair to like throw that at him all of a sudden because it's like, I don't know. I'd have to go read that peer-reviewed book and see what the argument actually is, and then I could come on and respond to it. That would be an appropriate response for Dr. Ehrman to say. But instead, he just, I have no idea what you're talking about, and moves on. He wouldn't have known that when he published Did Jesus Exist? That came out, I think, in 2012. I think I sent him a manuscript of On the Historicity of Jesus in 2013, and then it passed peer review and was published by Sheffield Phoenix Press in 2014. So his book would not know about the Philo stuff. But that was, 8 years ago now? He's been asked this question so many times since then, and claims to have read my peer-reviewed book, the peer-reviewed version that he claims to have read. I mean, I know in various times he's claimed to have done this. So he should know this material by now.
So, no, there are lots of Jesuses in Josephus, but you know what? There were a lot of Jesuses who played shortstop and second base when I was a kid in the 1960s. I mean, there are a lot of Jesuses out there playing shortstop. And so it's a common name. It just means Joshua. So it doesn't mean anything. There are lots of people with this name. These other Jesuses that are talked about by Josephus are not Messiah figures. There is one that has similar predictions of Jesus, and he predicts that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Jesus of Ananias. But Jesus of Ananias was living decades after we started getting stories about Jesus of Nazareth. And so
there's a number of weird things going on here. He keeps calling him Jesus of Ananias. It's Jesus, the son of Ananias. There's 20 points of connection, not just that he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. And in the end here, he's about to go on this rant about how, Jesus ben Ananias was decades after Jesus, which is true, which means that the original religion can't have been based on Jesus ben Ananias. That is absolutely true. But the Gospels are all after Jesus ben Ananias. And I think there's a moment where Dr. Ehrman after this, where he kind of admits that the gospel stories, some of the gospel stories, the early gospel stories, borrow material from the Jesus ben Ananias tale. He has a sort of valid argument about how that in and of itself would not mean that Jesus didn't exist, which I agree with. And I actually agree with what he started with in this answer, which is there's a ton of Jesuses. It just means Joshua. So that in and of itself is not super telling. You can't refute the historicity of Jesus with that. But what should be relevant here, he should mention that it doesn't just mean Joshua. What does Joshua mean? It means the savior of God, God's savior. And we're talking about God's savior. So when you have a religion that worships God's savior and that guy's name just happens to be God's savior, isn't it a really weirdly convenient name for the savior of God to be named? Like that's the argument that we should be addressing here. And you can come up with a rebuttal to that, but at least get the argument right? Figure out what the argument is. That alone is not enough to prove that Jesus didn't exist. And that's why there's no peer-reviewed argument for mythicism that bases its argument on what we're talking about here. But I have a whole section on the historicity of Jesus that Dr. Ehrman would know about if he had read the book, where I point out that Josephus has several, and this is from the peer-reviewed literature by multiple other scholars. They've pointed out that there are actually several figures in Josephus who are all messianic figures in the sense that they all are acting apocalyptically and claiming to bring about the end of the world and the salvation of Israel, etc. Each one of them engages in some sort of action that portrays them as the new Joshua. So the original Joshua, what did he do? He parted the Jordan. He felled the walls of Jericho. He did all these like magical things. There's a guy in Josephus who says he's going to magically fell the walls of Jerusalem. Obvious reference to Joshua felling the walls of Jericho, where Josephus is deliberately crafting the story, or possibly these figures did. Josephus is just reporting what their propaganda was. That's entirely possible too. But they're very definitely selling themselves as a Joshua, the new Joshua, who's going to liberate Israel and do a Joshua-like thing. That means that Josephus understands, and he expects his Jewish readers, doesn't expect his Gentile readers, but he expects his Jewish readers to get what he's talking about. These are Jesus Christ, because Christ means Messiah. These are obvious messianic figures. Josephus is writing them exactly that way, that these are Christs, and they are Joshuas, Jesuses. So he's written it, but he's specifically avoided the word Jesus and Christ, right? Josephus specifically avoids those words, but he paints a picture that his Jewish audience would get, oh, that's a Jesus Christ. That's a Jesus Christ. That's a Jesus Christ, etc. And they're all messianic figures, and they're all Joshua-based figures. And I point this out, it's like, and so you could even use this to argue for historicity. You could say like, well, Josephus records there's a bunch of these guys portraying themselves as Jesus Christ, doing things that get themselves killed to bring about the end of the world. So you could say, oh, well, if there's a bunch of guys like this, then the Christian history, the historical Jesus fits this model exactly. He could have been one of these dudes, like one of these guys claiming to be the new Jesus, new Joshua, and Christ, the new Christ figure, and he's going to get himself killed to bring about the end of the world, just like all these other guys. And, I have a response to that. I can argue why that doesn't hold up, and I point that out in the book. Like, it's not a good argument for historicity, but it's at least an available argument for historicity. And you can build a plausible theory of historicity for Jesus, our Jesus, based on that model, that he was just one of these guys, and he just wasn't famous enough to get mentioned in Josephus. Dr. Ehrman's been handed on a silver platter an opportunity to argue here against mythicism, but it would require him to have read my book. And he didn't. And so he says, oh, there's none of these guys in Josephus. And actually, there are. And it is mainstream. Mainstream literature today admits that there are. He just argues from the armchair on this subject. His book, Forgery and Counterforgery, and his book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, these are masterpieces of historical analysis. Like, they show deep competence. So he knows how to do this correctly. He's just choosing to phone it in, putting no effort in to even understand what the arguments are or to research them. For whatever reason, this is deeply frustrating to me because I know he knows how to do it correctly. He's just choosing not to.
But I want to push back on that, because wasn't he the one who was like killed with a catapult or something during the siege of Jerusalem? Or am I mistaken?
No, that's right. Near 70.
I want to push back. This is what he pushes back on. This is super frustrating. It's like, oh, he's going to push back on something. And then he says this, and like, that is literally the least important thing to push back on all the things that have happened in this video. Anyway, I just had to comment because that made me laugh. I was like, oh my God, really? I was so excited when he said, I have to push back. I'm like, oh, he's going to do his job. No, but it didn't happen. Damn it.
If that's the Jesus that has some parallels with the Jesus in the Gospels, and many of the Gospels, like for example, John wasn't written until around the year 90 after the fall of Jerusalem, couldn't that have been pulling elements from that character, that sort of messianic figure?
So Thomas says John was written in the 90s, which is, fair enough, maybe. But he picks John. Why did he pick John? I don't understand. Why is he talking about the Gospel of John? He says, well, John was written in the 90s after the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jesus ben Ananias parallels are in Mark, and some of them get preserved in Matthew and Luke, but they're mainly in Mark. They're not in John, I don't think. Like, there aren't many in John. Like, he's done no research on this. And if he'd read my book, he could have done. Like, he would not only know what I've written about it, but he would have the footnotes. He could go read the articles by Whedon and so on and be informed and be able to ask informed questions.
Paul in the 50s.
But for the later writings, if they're taking stories of these other messianic figures.
Okay. The reason it doesn't work is because John precisely does not have that message that Jesus of Ananias preached. The earlier Gospels do. Yeah. And that message is found in the sources behind those Gospels. It's found, for example, in the Q source and the M sources and the L sources, and it's found in Mark.
No, and he's going to give an argument. Even Q scholars are going to be pulling their hair out at the horribly bad argument that Dr. Ehrman is about to give for how we're supposed to know that Q existed. But he just casually just throws out, not just Q, L and M, it's in the M source, it's in the L source, it's in Q. No, it's in Mark. All the things that he's calling Q, M, and L, these are just redactions and riffs and developments based on the idea that Mark contrived. Because this is not in Paul. And it's interesting that Dr. Ehrman mentions Paul. Paul never says anything about Jesus predicting the destruction of Jerusalem or the Jerusalem temple. He does mention the end of the world. He says Jesus predicted the end of the world, and then Jesus is going to come down from the sky, and we're all going to fly up to be with Jesus. Like, that's in Paul. But he never says anything about Jesus predicting specifically that the Romans are going to come and destroy the Jewish temple. Like, that's not in Paul. It first appears in Mark. Mark invents this idea that Jesus predicted it, which is very typical for prophecy, that you retrodict. You have the prophet predict the thing after the thing has happened. You rewrite history, basically, and say, oh, our guy predicted that would happen. Like, that's common in history of religions. A lot of what Mark is doing, the Gospel of Mark, is trying to explain why God let the Romans, these heathens, these pagans, to come in and destroy his house, and still the world didn't end. Like, why would God let that happen? It doesn't this refute our entire religion. It proves that our God is fake. And so Mark is actually writing this whole story to kind of rehabilitate their religion and say, like, no, this is all part of God's plan. In fact, Jesus predicted it. It's all, the timetable is going. It's like, yeah, the world's still going to come. The world's still going to end. It's still going to come. The Gospel of Mark is all about this sort of apologetics, explaining how the religion can still be true despite the things that have happened. That is a point that Dr. Ehrman could have gone off on and saying, like, well, the religion cannot be based on Jesus ben Ananias because the religion predates Jesus ben Ananias. And I think that's kind of what Dr. Ehrman wanted to say here, and that's true, but that's not the argument that he's supposed to be responding to. The argument is that the historicization of Jesus, putting Jesus in history, interacting with Pontius Pilate is not in Paul, interacting with Romans not in Paul, Jesus walking around Galilee is not in Paul, etc. It's in Mark. And I think Dr. Ehrman seems to agree, like, he kind of avoids this. The scholarship in the field has proven that the Jesus ben Ananias story did affect the telling of the tale of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, which is true even if Jesus existed, which is the argument that Dr. Ehrman should be making here. He should say, like, well, yeah, the Gospels are building a story about Jesus. They're pulling ideas from a variety of different myths. They're using the myths of Moses to build out the nativity, especially since, Dr. Ehrman's talking about giving a seminar on the birth narratives, the nativities. He well knows that the Moses narrative is the thing that they're pulling from to build and invent a story about Jesus. And so he could say, oh yeah, Jesus ben Ananias, they're doing the same thing. They're borrowing materials from these stories to build stories about Jesus, but there's still a core that goes back to the original Jesus, who's an actual historical person. This is the argument that Dr. Ehrman here should be making. If he wants to make a good argument for historicity, he should be agreeing with Thomas and saying, oh yes, the Jesus ben Ananias story is influential in the gospel stories, but what I'm saying is that those are legends built on top of a simpler story of a real man. And then we can go talking about, like, how do we know that that real man existed? What do we know about him, etc. But that's not where Dr. Ehrman takes it. That's not where Thomas takes it. Like, neither of them seem to know what the hell is going on or what they're talking about in this context.
Been written somewhat a little bit after 70, but he wasn't living in Palestine, and the stories of Jesus of Ananias are found nowhere. So there's no way, suppose Mark was writing in Rome, as many people think, there's no way stories of Jesus of Ananias had reached Rome because nobody was even talking about Jesus of Ananias. Oh
God, stop there, please. Oh my God. All right. How do we know about Jesus ben Ananias, everyone? Children, little children, how do we know? Because it's in the Jewish War written by Josephus. Where did Josephus publish the Jewish War? Rome. When did he publish the Jewish War? Mid-70s. This idea, like, where do you think Mark, if he's writing in Rome? We actually don't know that. I think that's kind of a typical traditional scholarly assertion that Mark is writing in Rome. We actually don't have any evidence of that. Even the Latinisms in Mark don't mean that he was writing from Rome. Like, Latinisms could appear in every province of the Roman Empire. It's there's no good argument that Mark is actually writing in Rome. But let's assume, even just for the premise is true, that Mark is writing from Rome in the 70s, as Dr. Ehrman said. How does Dr. Ehrman not know, because multiple articles in the peer reviewed literature have said, Mark is getting this from the Jewish War, the book published by Josephus in Rome. That's how someone writing from Rome would know about this. It just got published, right? So rather than saying, like, well, actually, I haven't looked into this, I don't know where Mark could have gotten this, but rather than doing something like that, he just absolutely starts, no way, this makes no sense. It's impossible that Mark could be borrowing from Josephus. This is very frustrating.
Why would anybody think that a story mentioned by one source, Josephus, about something happening in the year 70s, influencing gospel traditions that are earlier than that? But
this is another example of Dr. Ehrman clearly does not know Whedon or any of the other literature that I cite on this, the other scholars who published on the Jesus ben Ananias parallels. If I were in this position, like, I say, like, oh, is there literature on this? I haven't read it. I can't really comment on that. Even if I offered speculations, I would be framing them as, well, maybe there's something I'm overlooking because I haven't read the literature on this, but here's my immediate take on it. But I could be wrong, right? Like, because I need to go look at what Whedon has said. I need to go look at what Carrier has said, and so on. That's not what he's doing. He's declaring adamant, omniscient, godlike knowledge that requires him to go nowhere further than his armchair. The scoffs, the guffaws, the laughter, and so on. He's acting arrogantly like, all these people are idiots for suggesting this, where he's really slagging off, like, major, prominent, respectable colleagues of his that have published journal articles under peer review about this. because he thinks he's just talking about me or other mythicists. He thinks it's safe to do this. But no, he's clearly just completely dismissive of the literature of his own field and doesn't think that he even needs to consult it to have opinions that are completely reliable. You notice he's like an unrelaxed, mocking, guffawing, laughing posture through the whole 20 minutes, right? He can't just dial back and say like, oh, well, let's just calmly discuss this. No, he is in an emotional peak. And you can see that the way he behaves is like this. But this is not uncommon. Like, you see this multiple times. He'll be doing a Q&A, he's totally calm and answering questions, yada, yada. Someone brings up mythicism and he just flips the lid. Like, it's very condescending, dismissive, and mocking. It's not taking the questions seriously at all.
It's like a timing discrepancy.
Well, that's what history is. I mean, history is about timing. If you have an anachronism, you're not going to say that whoever invented the microwave influenced the person who invented the convection oven. It doesn't make any sense. And so, of course, it didn't happen. Trump didn't influence George Washington. So chronology is pretty important. Your earlier question, though, was about Greek mythology. And this is where it really is important, because in Greek and Roman mythology, you certainly have stories about divine men who are sometimes born of a union of a mortal woman with a divine being who can do miracles, who are taken up to heaven when they die. And these stories, I think, almost certainly influenced storytellers who are telling stories about Jesus. And so the big task for serious historians is to figure out, when you have stories about Jesus, what parts of these stories actually have some kind of historical merit, and which parts are legendary accretions based on the kinds of things people would say about someone like this. That's the historical task.
Yeah.
But it isn't done by simply kind of, picking stuff you like and don't like and throwing it out or keeping it in. I have very serious friends who have spent 30 or 40 years working on just this problem, who know Greek and Hebrew and Latin and Aramaic. I mean, like, and so, it isn't just like, it's like Jesus. It's like, it doesn't work that way.
That is a valid argument. That's what you should say. There could still be a historical Jesus on which all of his legends attached. So here he's bringing it back to what I mentioned earlier is what the argument should be, which is that, Jesus ben Ananias was definitely used to formulate legends about Jesus, but that doesn't explain the origins of Christianity. It can't. And it doesn't prove that there's not a real Jesus onto which these legends are being piled. What Dr. Ehrman said right there is absolutely correct. Mythicists can go too far by assuming that, well, if the story of the crucifixion in Mark is based on Jesus ben Ananias, then Jesus didn't exist. That's not a valid sequence of argument. You can keep building on that to get a valid argument, but that by itself is not a good argument. And Dr. Ehrman is right to say that that is itself not a good argument. But then we do need to get into the weeds of, well, how are you going to determine that anything in this legend is true? It's true that it's possible, it's possible there's a historical man upon which all this is being piled, but it's also possible, equally possible, that there wasn't. Moses was created out of whole cloth, Romulus out of whole cloth. We're pretty sure Dionysus and Hercules, probably Aesop. So the question we want to ask is, how do you tell the difference between these two things? And that's the conversation that we should be having here, right? This is what I want to see. How do you do this? And in your answer, could you please respond to the criticisms that have already been leveled at what you've in the past said? Q is a good example of this. You do need valid methods. You can't use bogus methods. And he says, well, I know all these smart people who know all these languages that are doing this. Yeah, but that doesn't mean anything they're doing is valid methodologically. They might be using faulty methods. So we need to have that conversation. Are they? How do we tell? What are they doing? Why do you think that what they're doing is valid?
I argue against Jesus' birth story based on date issues, but have a hard time supporting where Quirinius was from 4 BCE to 6 CE.
The nativity in Matthew, the birth of Jesus in Matthew, and the nativity in Luke contradict each other historically. The things they mention as having happened 10 years apart. They're both basically dating Jesus to different years. And so they've got 4 BC to 6 CE. That's it. Matthew is putting the birth of Jesus sometime between 6 and 4 BC. Luke is putting the birth of Jesus sometime around 6 CE. That's assuming that either of these authors even freaking knew the chronology of what they're talking about. They might not have. But it doesn't matter. What they wrote is putting the birth of Jesus in these 10 years apart. And there's no overlap. They're 10 years apart. You can't pull them together. So there's tons of apologetics to try and reconcile this. This is one of the biggest contradictions in the Bible, one of the most difficult to resolve. So there's a huge apologetic literature with 20 different attempts. Quirinius. So Luke says Jesus was born when Quirinius took a census of Judea. Josephus, and actually more than Josephus, and several sources mention that Quirinius took the first census of Judea in 5 or 6 CE. In fact, we have coins that show the introduction of the Roman dominance of Judea start in 5 CE, 5 or 6 CE, depending on what calendar you use. Herod the Great has been dead for 10 years by then, right? So that's why Matthew's story doesn't line up with this. But a lot of the apologetics will involve maybe Quirinius took a census of Judea in 4 BC. You can't prove he didn't. Maybe he took 2 censuses of Judea. There are a number of reasons why that's impossible. It goes into the details of Roman history, Roman political history, Roman administrative and bureaucratic history, and so on. I go into all of that, cited sources and scholarship and so on. So people who are interested in answering that question, you totally want to get my chapter in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. For every argument that's ever been made to try and reconcile these two birth narratives, I cover there. I have an answer to everything pretty much.
Another one, of course, Jesus never existed. Even Paul never puts him here on earth, but in a spiritual realm.
Oh yeah, where does Paul do that exactly?
And then he
Where does
mentions...
Paul do that?
You could answer this question. It's kind of moot to the argument, but you could answer the question that when Paul says that he's having this conversation with Jesus in 2 Corinthians 12, this is well after Jesus had died, the historical Jesus, according to Dr. Ehrman. I don't think Dr. Ehrman thinks that Jesus like descended from heaven, joined earth, and then visited Paul in this zombie body and had this conversation with Paul. I think even Dr. Ehrman would admit, well, obviously claims to be having this vision with Jesus in heaven. He's talking to a celestial Jesus. It's kind of offensive for Dr. Ehrman to mock the idea when even he himself knows that Paul understood Jesus to be in heaven. Rather than mock the idea that Paul believes that Jesus lives in heaven, he could at least admit that even he agrees that, yes, at the time that Paul's writing his letters, he believes Jesus is in heaven. And when he's talking to Jesus, he's talking to a celestial Jesus. This is not controversial. There's no mainstream scholar who would disagree with this. But no, instead he mocks the whole concept. And I don't understand why do that. Like, why not just admit what's correct and then present what your modification to that view is? Instead of this, he just irrationally mocks the idea that Paul believes Jesus was in heaven. This makes no sense. Even coming from Dr. Ehrman, it makes no sense.
One of the points that I think that Ehrman has actually flipped on is the idea that the Messiah archangel figure of Jesus is actually a pre-existent figure, even in Paul's time, right?
He previously criticized and mocked me for siding with, which was at the time, a lot of peer-reviewed scholars. Even Paul believed that Jesus was a pre-existent archangel. Dr. Ehrman mocked me for that, completely flipped on it, wrote a whole book defending my position on it, never apologized or corrected his criticisms of me on this point. But that has to do with pre-existence. I think he would even agree with the post-mortem existence. Dr. Ehrman has never advocated, nor would he ever advocate, that the resurrected Jesus was like the wandering Jew. He was like walking around earth for the rest of his afterlife. No, he knows that Paul understands Jesus to be in heaven at that point, after resurrection. There's no point to mock this view. He should be responding to it, which is different. Yes, Paul believed that the resurrected Jesus was in heaven. That is correct. But here's my reasons for believing that Paul understood Jesus to have been on earth before his death. And Dr. Ehrman throws out some of the reasons that he thinks that. He doesn't seem aware of the rebuttals to those reasons, but he at least offers those reasons eventually. But at this one moment here, he seems to forget that even he agrees with what Thomas is saying. And his disagreement is actually on a different aspect of it, related to chronology, which Dr. Ehrman just made a big issue out of. But anyway, this kind of behavior is emotional and childish and unproductive.
I don't know. I'm just reading the comment.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. People say this. Like, Paul has Jesus being crucified in heaven. Okay? Show me what verse that one's in. Paul says he was born of a woman. He says he was born a Jew. He says that he had a brother named James. Paul talks about things that Jesus said. He talks about what he said at the Last Supper.
Mm-hmm. This is the equivocation fallacy you get from Dr. Ehrman all the time. He says, well, Paul mentions disciples. No, he doesn't. Paul mentions the Last Supper. No, he doesn't. Paul says that the Lord told him that he did a thing. So this is a vision that Paul's talking about that resembles what later got turned into the Last Supper in the Gospels. The significant thing here is these are passages that historicists cite in favor of historicity, and they were the ones that I took seriously and examined. And some of them I even count as evidence for historicity and on historicity of Jesus, on the a fortiori side of my margins of error. He should by now know that we have answers to all these claims. So for him to just casually assert these things as if we've never heard of this before, like this is actually how he's acting right now. He's acting like, well, they've never heard of these passages. Let me cite some passages at you. That's weird behavior from someone who knows that there are rebuttals to these and knows that this is a fruitless thing to say. You can't just keep repeating the argument that's been refuted. That is not a rebuttal. You have to actually respond to the refutations. And so he doesn't do that, or even acknowledge that there are rebuttals to what he's saying. Each one of the passages he's referring to in Paul, they're very ambiguous. They actually are not as clear-cut as he's making them out to be. And they don't actually argue that strongly for the alternative view that he's pushing, or for the view that he's pushing. And so one has to actually address the things we pointed out. Like, this is one of the things when I got the postdoc grant to do the research on this, I was keen to actually find enough evidence that I could securely argue for the historicity of Jesus, because I felt like at the point I was kind of in a liminal space where I was like, well, I've heard some good arguments against. I haven't heard good rebuttals to those arguments from the historicists. So I spent 6 years researching it. So let me see if I can find those. Are there good answers to this? I didn't. In fact, the further I looked at it, the weaker these arguments looked. Like, these are very apologetical, rhetorical responses to mythicism. They don't hold up on examination. They're actually much more ambiguous than is laid out. And so if you're going to defend them, you need to respond to the points that we've made about like why these are ambiguous. Like, why are you so confident that when Paul says he's born of a woman, that he's talking about an actual woman, when in the actual passage, like the actual argument, a few sentences later says, well, these women are allegories. And, literally he says like these women are allegories. And then it goes on, this is a problem, right? And so there's another example of he says James is his brother. Well, actually, Paul never mentions biological brothers of Jesus, but you know what he does mention? He has multiple times mentions that all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. He says, Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. We are all the adopted sons of God. We all cry out, Abba, Father, upon our baptism, etc. So all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. And that's the only kind of brother of the Lord that Paul ever explicitly discusses. He never says anything about biological brothers of the Lord. This means that you can't just casually assert this verse as evidence. You've got a problem you have to overcome before you can actually use this verse as evidence for historicity. This is the actual argument that's happening in the world outside the head of Bart Ehrman. He's just completely ignoring the argument. He's not even engaging with the argument. He's just acting like the argument doesn't even exist. And this is unproductive. You can't move this debate forward if you're not even going to acknowledge that there is a debate, much less what it is. And so this kind of behavior really offends me, coming from a scholar who should know better. Fictive kinship terminology is all throughout the letters of Paul. But using the full phrase, brothers of the Lord specifically, appears only twice. In both of those places, Paul needs to distinguish rank and file Christians from apostolic Christians, higher ranking Christians. And it's conspicuously only in those two places that you hear about brothers of the Lord. There's an issue here that needs to be addressed. Dr. Ehrman's just ignoring it. He's not responding to the argument at all. I tried to find something that would hold together. I looked at every thread and they don't hold up. That's how I ended up where I am. I think Dr. Ehrman's not even like a tenth of the way to where I am. Like he's assiduously avoiding even engaging in this fact-checking and questioning.
Daniel M. Saying, it seems to me Bart Ehrman needs Jesus to have existed for some reason. It wouldn't surprise me if he later joined Christianity.
I don't think this is evidence that he's going to become a Christian. There are a lot of issues orbiting around Dr. Ehrman. One is he has an entire career built out of trying to reconstruct the historical Jesus, almost all of which he would have to throw in the trash if he were to suddenly admit that Jesus didn't exist. So he has perfectly ordinary secular career reasons to be backing the historical Jesus. He's also got a believing wife. Like his wife is a Christian. He's commented himself publicly that she's not very comfortable with his agnosticism and his non-Christianity. I can only imagine the stress and difficulty in the marriage that would result if he were to suggest that Jesus didn't even exist and started going publicly about this, that this might create problems at home. There's no end to ulterior motives that are possible for why he's so emotional about this issue and so adamant on it. I don't claim to know. I don't, there could be any number of reasons. I don't see any trajectory in which he's heading towards believing Christianity. I think he has ordinary earthly secular reasons to be stuck on this.
Jesus Christ is the only quote-unquote Messiah that has the name Savior, etymologically speaking. Is that a strong case for mythicism?
It's not a strong case, but it is grounds for suspicion. It's one of those things that you like side-eye that you're like, okay, maybe I should check into this, make sure this guy's real, because that is dubious. Now, I do make the point on the historicity of Jesus that it is entirely possible that there was a historical Jesus and that in life he was not called Jesus. He might have been Matthias or something. Like he might have had any random name. And that Jesus Christ is actually a label that was attached to him afterwards for the same reason. He's the new Joshua, therefore we're going to call him Jesus. He's the Messiah, therefore we're going to call him Christ, etc. That is actually compatible with a historical Jesus. That could happen. It's totally believable. I think something similar happened to Peter, where his name is Kephas, which is not a name in Aramaic, but Paul refers to him by that as his name multiple times. Kephas means rock. It's like a nickname. That sounds like a cultic name that Peter adopted for himself. And Peter means rock in Greek, so it's just the Greek translation of Kephas in Aramaic. Peter, whoever he was, might have actually been Simon, like the Gospels say, right? The Gospels say it's Simon Peter. Jesus assigned the name to him. The actual history could be that there was a Simon who started this religion. He claimed he had a vision of this celestial Christ figure who renamed him, says, you are the rock of my mission now, so go forth and spread the gospel. And so he went around calling himself Rock because God's Savior appeared to me in a dream and told me that's my name now. So that would be an example of a historical person who changed their name to something spiritually relevant. And we only know him by that name in the letters of Paul. So the same thing could have happened to Jesus. Jesus could have been a historical guy by who knows what name. And then because of what he went through and because of what people believed about him, they started calling him Jesus Christ, even though those weren't his names. And so the suspiciousness of the names does not decisively prove that it wasn't a historical person to which those names became attached. But it is grounds to be suspicious to actually check. It could be either one, right? Either one sound pretty plausible. So we should go check and see what the evidence is. In my experience, when you go check, it doesn't pan out. The evidence comes out pretty poor for a historical Jesus. But, that was my experience.
Dragons in Genesis podcast said Nailed by David Fitzgerald and Jesus from Outer Space by Richard Carrier are required reading for this topic.
Fitz has a lot of cool shit in volume 1 of Jesus, Mything in Action, where he focuses specifically on the mundane Jesus theory. It's mostly he's dealing with that. It's like, well, what if we reject, like Bart Ehrman does, we reject all the divine claims about Jesus. Is there still a Jesus left over that we can defend? And so he goes into like why that's not credible. But he does some other interesting things in there. One of the things in volume 1 that I find is almost worth the book by itself is that he got a crew of people to literally call every university, I think in North America, I think they definitely did US, they might have been Canada too, I can't remember the exact count, but everyone has a religious studies department, all of them, and ask them, do you require signing a contract swearing to support a dogma of your staff, basically? So I think they came out with like 1 in 3, tons of these schools, and some of them tried to avoid admitting that they did this, but they require their professors to swear that they will never contradict anything of the religious dogma that the school supports. If they do, they'll get fired. So basically you can't trust anything that comes from these professors because they have basically sold their soul. They've sold away their academic freedom. That kind of thing discredits anything that they're trying to argue that touches on these issues that they would be fired for if they were to admit the truth. He actually went out and did the freaking journalistic work, built the data, and shows that like this is not a terribly reliable field. You have grounds to be suspicious when arguments are being made in a certain way, and you should fact check them. You shouldn't just assume anyone is telling you the truth. Now, this doesn't apply to Dr. Ehrman because he's not under one of these contracts, and nor would he be.
Bart Ehrman, he's got a bachelor's degree from a religious university, I believe, and then he's got a master's of divinity and then a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary.
True. He has no advanced degrees in history. This is true. Normally, I wouldn't harp on that, except for the fact that he keeps ragging on me for not having a degree in New Testament studies. No, I have an actual degree in history, and he does not. So really, he shouldn't be throwing stones in this glass house.
Paul knew Jesus' brother James, and Paul knew his closest disciple, Peter. Look, the only way to write these things off is simply to have
Notice he throws in the word disciple.
An agenda.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not
it always. That's one thing that really grinds my gears is when people are like, well, Paul knew disciples. No, he knew apostles.
Right.
They're the same thing.
But they're not. The words don't mean the same thing. Disciple would actually imply sitting at the feet of someone, because Matthias means someone who's a student of a teacher. Apostolos, however, means someone who's sent. It means a messenger, which is much more in concurrence with the idea of a revelation, which we see in 1 Clement, for example, and we see in Romans 10, in Paul's letters and stuff. The idea that Jesus appeared to people, delivered them a message and said, go forth and spread the message, because I can't. I'm appearing to you as a vision. I can't run around people. You got to run around telling people. So apostle actually is much more congruent with the revelatory cult, that you have to spread the message that you got mystically. Whereas disciple would imply an actual historical person who collected students and taught them in life. It is significant that Paul has no knowledge of the word disciple or of anyone being a disciple. That actually is relevant to this. The distinction between apostle and disciple matters for that reason, because of the underlying Greek and what those words mean.
Where you are certain that there couldn't be a Jesus, and because you've got a reason for thinking that. There's nobody who would go into this open-minded, who would just look at the evidence and it would even occur to them.
I was a rabid anti-mythicist. When I was the feedback editor for the Secular Web, I would shut this shit down and say, no, that is stupid. I'm working on my graduate degree in history. Mainstream scholars all agree there's a historical Jesus. And of course, all the stuff I was seeing was like this crank mythicist bullshit. And it was easily debunkable as nonsense. And so I was very much against mythicism. I was hostile to it the way that Dr. Ehrman is here, until several people convinced me to read Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle. And then when I read that, I was like, well, that's actually a fairly competent argument. It has some flaws, but they aren't fatal, and I couldn't find a response to it. So at that point, I'm agnostic. I could go either way based on how this debate plays out. And so I went into my postdoc research on the historicity of Jesus with an open mind. I was like, this could go either way. I was really teetering on either side of this and had been on the opposite side of it. The further I went in, I was like, shit, this is actually a much better argument than I thought. And so that's how I ended up where I am. I was not a mythicist from the beginning.
I'm not talking about Christians. I don't know any historians who take this seriously.
He says this a lot. This is bullshit. It really offends me that he keeps saying this. Because every time he says this, and he says it like year after year after year, I come out with a list of bona fide, qualified scholars who do say this, or who say it's plausible. They either say it's plausible, but they don't agree with it, or they're agnostic, or they're on board with it. And now I'm up to 20. You can go to my blog, look for Bart Ehrman recap. Item 22 in there. I keep adding to that. I think I have a few more to add coming up. No, the number's growing. So when he says, I don't know one, well, actually, at the moment that he says this, there were two, not one, but two separate scholars who published under peer review in major peer-reviewed biblical studies presses who are on board with this. How can he claim he doesn't know one when there are two that he should definitely know about? He's been called out on this multiple times. He should know about the other dozen or so. It's definitely not none. But he keeps saying it. It's like William Lane Craig keeps, after physicist after physicist points out that he's lying about the science. Craig will get up before an audience and repeat the same lies over and over again as if he'd never been rebutted. And this is extremely frustrating. It pisses me off. And here we have Bart Ehrman doing the same damn thing for no good reason. He's not even a Christian. Why is he doing this? I don't know. Why does he have to craft this lie and deny the existence of scholars, many scholars, who actually do think this is at least plausible or more than?
They aren't Christians. They just know how to do history. So why is it the mythicists make fun of us for doing history and think that, well, don't you realize that Jesus was crucified in heaven? Where are you getting that from? Besides somebody else who told you that. Yeah, and it's what you want to know. You want to believe it, so you believe it. Well, okay, I don't think there's a moon landing.
Yeah, he does the moon landing. He's about to mention the Holocaust. And then he does the January 6th insurrection, all of which so massively well documented that if we had that kind of evidence for Jesus, we wouldn't even be here. They're not just false analogies. They're just outrageously false analogies. And the Holocaust one is particularly offensive because, there is Holocaust denial is a real phenomenon. And the evidence against it, like we have people who are alive today who are there. You're gonna call this in and say like, well, anybody who doubts the historicity of Jesus is like a Holocaust denier. No, they aren't. Not in any possible metric. They're nowhere near the same thing. And frankly, stop using the Holocaust as an analogy, because that was actually a really horrible event.
Paul says he's born of a woman doesn't mean he was, but that's not the argument being made. Saying that Jesus was born of a woman is proof that Paul is not arguing that Jesus is up in this heavenly realm exclusive.
No, I mean, it's a weird thing to say he was born of a woman, but he has reasons to say it. But, it's not...
Oh, I like that he admits that it's a problematic statement. But all the reasons that historicists advance make no sense in context. Like, it doesn't fit at all. For example, they'll say, he needed to establish that Jesus was Jewish. It's like, what, everyone born of a woman is Jewish? When the nation of Israel was founded, they decided that it would be matrilineal because it's much easier to prove that someone was born of a woman than born of a man. This is before DNA. But that was a modern national policy. It did not exist in antiquity. Being born of a Jewish woman did not make you Jewish. It doesn't matter because Paul doesn't say a Jewish woman anyway. So why would he say a woman? Spoiler alert, he does say why. It just isn't what Dr. Ehrman wants you to think that he says is the reason.
Yeah. Methodists get really upset that New Testament scholars don't take them seriously. I know that. But you need to come up with better arguments.
We did, Dr. Ehrman. If only you would pay attention to them. For audience, watch this. Spot the fallacy.
It's possible that Luke was copying from Matthew rather than having a separate source, or that Matthew's copying from Luke, but you said that there's very, very good reasons to think that that's not happening.
Yeah.
What are those reasons?
So Matthew and Luke and Mark, the three of them have many stories in common that are sometimes word for word the same. And so somebody's copying somebody. And there are pretty good reasons for thinking that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. It would take me 5 minutes to explain the reasons, but they're so convincing that since the 19th century, just about everybody who's tried to study this thing said, yeah, that's probably right. Yep. Matthew and Luke also have a number of sayings of Jesus that they have in common that are not found in Mark. So they had some source for that, but it's not Mark. So the question is, did Luke copy Matthew? Did Matthew copy Luke? Or did they both copy a different source? So the argument, I'm not sure I can do this very quickly, effectively, but I talk about this in a number of my books. When Matthew and Luke have these materials that are not found in Mark, they are almost always in a different sequence in their Gospels. So the Lord's Prayer will be here in Matthew and it'll be down here in Luke. The Beatitudes will be here in Luke and it'll be up here in Matthew. And so they're in different sequence. But the stories from Mark are almost always in the same sequence. What that suggests is that if Matthew had copied Mark and that Luke had copied Matthew, then it means that whenever Luke was copying Matthew, he had a copy of Mark on his lap and a copy of Matthew on his lap. If it was in Mark, then he'd keep the order. If he saw it's not there, then he would change the order. It's like, what? No one writes a book like that. It's more likely that they both have some other source of sayings. They got Mark, they copy Mark. They don't know what the sequence of sayings are. They're just like sayings. And so they plug them into different places.
So he says that they wouldn't sit with the two books and take one in the sequence and one out of sequence. But by his own argument, they had to have. If they had Mark and Q, and they would never dare take pieces out of sequence, then they wouldn't have taken Q out of sequence. So clearly they're doing the thing that he says, by his own argument, they would never do. So he's refuted himself. So they're using Q in the way that he claims they would never use Q. They're taking things and putting them out of order. And then he's using that as an argument that Luke would never do that to Matthew. So he's refuted himself. The argument is self-refuting. This is garbage history. I just can't even believe that he thinks that this is even an argument, much less a good argument, much less a very good argument. It's especially problematic because almost everything else he says is false. It is not true that Matthew and Luke keep Mark in the same order. They reorder pieces of Mark a lot, which actually refutes this, shows that they actually both look at Mark and are willing to reorder the text. His argument is not even factually premised. Like the premise is false. If you notice in the way he framed this argument, it's crucial that he says that Q is just this random collection of sayings. Absolutely false. 100% false. We have absolute concrete evidence that Q has narrative material, and that in fact, Matthew and Luke keep some of that narrative material in conjunction with the sayings. So a classic example is the Sermon on the Mount, which Luke turns into the Sermon on the Plain. I might be confusing one or the other, but there's two sequences of sayings in Matthew and Luke that are supposedly coming from Q, both of which are followed by the same sayings in the centurion tale. So if they're using Q, first of all, that means that Q has narrative material. It's a gospel. It's not a collection. It's not a random collection of sayings. Or Occam's razor, Luke is just redacting Matthew. The argument that Dr. Ehrman just gave is the stupidest argument for Q I have ever heard in my life, given that it's self-refuting as well as refuted by all the evidence. Like, this almost discredits his entire career. Like, if he thinks this is a valid argument, how do we trust his judgment on frickin' anything? Like, he can't even see the self-contradictory statements. He doesn't know the basic facts of how Luke and Matthew use Mark. He doesn't know the basic facts of how they're using each other. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And there's no reason for him to not know what he's talking about here. It's not like he's some rando. He has the qualifications. He knows how to check these things. So why hasn't he? This is what frustrates me. There's no respectable reason for this argument to be coming from the mouth of this man. He should know better, honestly. He really does. He really should know better. He has the qualifications to know better.
And so that's the argument. It's the argument of sequence.